In March 2020, the government declared a national state of disaster for the first time since disaster management laws were passed. It's now been 21 months or 91 weeks later, and we're still there. My next guest says it's time to work out how to exit the state of disaster. Professor Dewald van Niekerk heads the African Center for Disaster Studies. He's part of a team set up by the government to evaluate the state's response to the pandemic. Let's find out how we get out of this state and what can be used in its place. Professor, thank you so much for your time. You believe it's possible to exit the state of disaster and still protect citizens. How would that work?
Good morning, Professor. Yes, most definitely. I think what we need to do is understand that the Disaster Management Act is very specific in the definition of what a disaster is. And I believe in these 20 months we've progressed beyond the point that we can actually safely say that we are within that state of disaster. And if that is the case, the Disaster Management Act does not apply where other legislation makes provision for the eventuality. And I believe that it's a very unsustainable situation in which we find ourselves. And through other means and other laws, we now need to look at how can we ensure that these regulations that keeps the system of hand sanitizing and social distancing and curfews, etc. in place, how we can carry on with that because it's a good mitigative measure, but still will and actually exit the national state of disaster.
So what are the tools that could be used instead of the state of disaster?
Well, we do have the National Health Act. In the Health Act, it makes provision for the minister to make certain regulations after consulting with the National Health Council. That obviously needs to go through an oversight process through Parliament. And I believe through the National Health Act, we can make these regulations. There's a 3-month period of consultation linked to that as well. But in certain circumstances, like we currently have, that can be fast-tracked in order to ensure that these regulations are in place. I know the previous minister tried this around about a year ago, I think October last year. It wasn't very popular at the time, but I think we've now seen that there's an outcry for a bit more parliamentary oversight into the decisions that we're making, and I think we've learned a lot. And therefore, I believe that the National Health Act provides us with that vehicle for putting these regulations in place.
You said the previous health minister tried to use the Health Act to regulate the measures to fight COVID-19, but it wasn't popular. Why?
Well, I think at that stage, remember the current COVID Command Council is in place specifically for the disaster, for this pandemic. The security cluster under the NAT joints are currently managing the whole process. So it's not specifically driven from the disaster risk management side. And I think there's been quite a few concerns around security issues relating to this as well. We saw what happened with the riots linked to so many other elements as well. And I believe it's most probably just to play the cards close to their chest at that stage. I haven't got insight exactly to why that was not allowed at that stage in the pandemic. And I think they probably believe that the Disaster Management Act makes adequate provision for what they want to. But at that stage, I don't think there was such a massive outcry as we now see people really feeling that this is encroaching quite a lot on civil liberties, and there needs to be more oversight into the decisions that's being taken. And like I said, I think it's time for us to move on and not use the Disaster Management Act for absolutely everything that we are seeing now.
Professor, are we really past the point of disaster? We're seeing the virus evolve, the emergence of different variants. Is it really safe to say we're past disaster point?
I see the definition of a disaster, a national disaster, is that something that exceeds our ability to cope using our own resources. That's a defining part of it, is can we cope? Do we have enough resources for that? I think we've proven that we do have that. With the measures that we put in place, as elementary as they are with the non-pharmaceutical interventions, and then also supported by the vaccine rollout, I believe we're moving in the right direction. And I don't think through a national state of disaster there's anything more that we can do. We can't evoke any other more extraordinary measures in order to deal with the situation than what we are now currently doing. And I think we are in a rhythm of using these non-pharmaceutical interventions, and then also trying to get the vaccine rolled out in more areas and get more people vaccinated. So I don't believe that that part of the Disaster Management Act is actually now necessary.
Finally, Professor, pandemics could be with us for a long time. What about long-term planning for any future disasters?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, that's one of the major issues that we sit with. The Disaster Management Act is very specific in calling all sectors of government, line ministries, various spheres of government to engage in disaster risk management planning. It must become part and parcel of what they do on a day-to-day basis. There's all the expectation from the National Disaster Management Framework, which is the current policy, that there must be focal points, trained people specifically from that discipline, whether it is transport or health in this case, in disaster risk management, that they can do long-term planning and look at all possible scenarios, levels of intensities, whatever the particular hazard may be, and then to work out plans accordingly. And that's the major problem we still sit with in South Africa, that before this pandemic, disaster risk management wasn't taken seriously. And I think this has been a wake-up call for many ministries. But this is what we need to do going forward. We need to be doing medium and long-term planning for hazards, particular for that environment in which the sector find themselves.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Professor Dewald van Niekerk of the Northwest University Center for Disaster Studies saying we need to move out of the state of disaster. Let's take